The flat, emerald green fields of California stretch out like a permanent oasis. But beneath the neat rows of crops, the ground itself is cracking apart. We rarely talk about what it actually takes to keep this landscape alive, or what happens when the earth underneath it begins to fail. This map highlights a flat basin occupying less than 1% of America's total farmland. Yet out of that tiny footprint comes approximately 1/4 of all the food consumed in the United States. The concentration of agricultural production operates like a series of monopolies. This soil yields 95% of America's processing tomatoes and 98% of its pistachios. Zoom out to a global scale, and you will find that roughly 80% of every almond eaten on Earth is grown right here. The animal agriculture hits a similar extreme. Tulare County is home to somewhere between 375,000 and 500,000 dairy cows, easily outnumbering the human population. Generating over $8 billion annually, it is the highest-grossing agricultural county in the nation. Down in Bakersfield, two single companies, Grimway and Bolthouse Farms, control up to 80. Growing permanent tree crops in a dry valley demands astronomical amounts of water. A single almond requires approximately 1 full gallon of water to reach maturity. Multiply that by billions, and the surface rivers quickly run dry. When local water isn't enough, engineers have to physically drag it out of the valley. The A.D. Edmonston pumping plant uses 14 massive pumps to push water nearly 2,000 feet up and over the mountains to Los Angeles. It consumes more electricity than any other single facility in California. Up north, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta supplies fresh water to 2/3 of the state's population, but that entire system is held together by thousands of miles of fragile dirt levees, many of them originally reclaimed by hand in the 1860s and quietly disintegrating today. This geological cross-section shows what happens when surface water runs out and farms drill downward. As they pump millions of gallons from the aquifers below, an impermeable layer beneath the valley called the Corcoran clay begins to permanently compress. The land surface has no choice but to sink with it. We can measure exactly how fast this is happening. In some parts of the San Joaquin Valley, between 1925 and 1977, the ground level plummeted by 29 feet. It is the largest human-caused alteration of the Earth's surface in the nation's history. For the town of Corcoran, this geology is an immediate crisis. The entire city has subsided so deeply into the earth that it now sits physically lower than the agricultural canals designed to flow past it. Decades of relentless agricultural expansion have triggered a geographical collapse. Now, California taxpayers are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to repair sinking canals and build special levees, fighting a desperate battle just to keep the irrigation system from drowning the towns it was built to support. While the earth caves in on itself, the people living and working on the surface are absorbing the environmental fallout. The economic engine of the valley runs on a massive, often marginalized labor force. In the 1930s, the Dust Bowl migration brought hundreds of thousands of refugees into the region. The federal government built migratory labor facilities to house them, including the Arvin Federal Government Camp, immortalized as Weed Patch Camp. Those original tin structures were designed as emergency shelters for a crisis that ended 90 years ago. Today, in the 2020s, those exact same cabins are still operating as subsidized housing for migrant farm workers. Beyond the housing, the local resources are deeply compromised. In Allensworth, a historic town in Tulare County, residents rely on a water supply contaminated with arsenic at 15 times the legal limit. This map illustrates an anomalously high methane cloud hovering over Fresno and Kern counties. It covers roughly 1,500 square miles, an invisible layer of concentrated greenhouse gas larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. That plume vents directly upward from the valley's two most lucrative industries, the massive industrial dairy operations and the oil fields pulling petroleum from ancient marine sediments. The immense fortunes extracted from these fields come with a steep local cost. The valley's legendary abundance relies on an environment that actively poisons the air, drains the water, and fails the very workforce required to pull that wealth from the dirt. Geography rarely tolerates extreme engineering forever. After a century of intensive terraforming, the natural systems of the Central Valley are beginning to assert themselves again. For thousands of years, the Southern Valley was anchored by Tulare Lake. Fed by Sierra Nevada rivers, it was the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. But to expand the farmland, settlers diverted those rivers. By the 1920s, the lake was drained entirely, and its massive basin was paved over with crops. Then, in the spring of 2023, the water suddenly returned. Heavy storms overwhelmed the engineered diversions, and 178 square miles of the old lakebed re-emerged, drowning 94,000 acres of active farmland under standing water. The indigenous Tachi-Yokut people had lived around the water for centuries. Their oral traditions maintained that the lake had not been destroyed, only pushed away. When the waters returned, it proved that the ancient geography was merely sleeping beneath the tomatoes and cotton. That flood was a warning. The U.S. Geological Survey models a recurring historical megastorm scenario known as arcstorm. Driven by relentless atmospheric rivers, the projected flooding would cost over $1 trillion, breaching the fragile levees and turning the entire valley floor back into a 300-mile-long inland sea. The consequences of a disaster here reach far beyond the state line. Since this single valley produces a quarter of the nation's food, a collapsing levee or a dry aquifer becomes a direct crisis for every grocery store in the United States. We have engineered a miracle of abundance on a foundation of sinking earth and vanishing water. As the geology continues to fail, we have to decide where we draw the line between protecting the natural resources we have left and extracting every last drop to feed the nation.